Welcome to part 2 of the How to Read a Book series. I began this series with an introduction to the book How to Read a Book, The Classic Guide to Intelligent Reading by Mortimer J. Adler and Charles Van Doren. I talked a little bit about its authors in the first video, and I covered the introduction and chapter 1, The Activity and the Art of Reading. If you missed that one, the link is above, and it's in the description box below. The biggest takeaway that I got from part 1 is that you really have to be an active reader to understand what you're reading. They made a big distinction between reading for understanding and reading for information. And this applies to books that are beyond your comprehension, that you really have to work to understand what the author's saying and to be able to say it again in your own words. And even though I've been an avid reader for most of my life, I'm not crystal clear on how to do this yet, but I'm hoping this book will make it easier as we go along. Today we're going to cover 2 chapters. Chapter 2 is the levels of reading, and Chapter 3 is the first level of reading, which is elementary reading. Let's look at Chapter 2 first. In Adler and Van Doren's scheme, there are 4 levels to reading, and these levels are cumulative. By that, I mean that you have to grasp the one before each level before you can move on to the next level. The bottom step in the ladder is elementary reading. Ordinarily, this level should be attained by the time a person is in 9th grade in the U.S., and hopefully most students will attain it by the end of 6th grade. At this level, the reader has gone from seeing black squiggly marks on a page to having those squiggly marks magically transform into words that have meaning. This is sometimes accomplished with ease, but often, unfortunately, it's not. All sorts of things can impede a person's progress in learning to read, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. They say that a lot of people never really leave this stage. Even if you're a good reader and understand almost everything you read, you can re-enter this stage at any time by trying to learn a foreign language, for example, or maybe trying to read Chaucer in Middle English. And then there's also the experience you may have had, I know I have, of reading in a subject area that you're not familiar with. The vocabulary may not be familiar. You may not have concepts that you need to grasp what you're reading. That happens with me a lot when I try to read philosophy. I don't have the vocabulary available to comprehend what I'm reading. Maybe you can think of a subject that you struggle with for the same reason. The second level of reading they isolate is inspectional reading. This is the type of reading you have to understand if you're under time constraints. So you may remember practicing this in school or maybe being tested on it. Maybe you're given 15 minutes to read a long article and then try to regurgitate everything that you remember about it or try to answer questions about it. Some careers, like those in law and medicine, require a lot of inspectional reading, but we all have times when we need to read at that level. I mean, maybe you can relate to going to a doctor's office and you need to read through a lot of forms and fill them out very quickly. So you need to grasp what you're reading fast. So at the first level, they point out you are reading to understand sentences. But at the second level, you would read to find out what an entire book or an article is about. They say many people, even good readers, don't understand the importance of skillful reading at level 2. Moving on up, we go to level 3, which is analytical reading, and that's what the majority of this book is going to be about. At this level of reading, you read a book or an article or a poem or whatever to the best of your ability. You grant it all the time you need to understand it. And naturally, this can be a demanding and time-consuming process depending on what you want to read. This skill would be valuable for anyone who is trying to read, say, a law contract of some sort and need to understand it before they sign it. But when this kind of reading applies to books, they quote Francis Bacon. Maybe you're familiar with this quote. Some books are meant to be tasted. Others are to be chewed and digested. At this level of reading, you're chewing and digesting. If every book we read required this level of reading, most people would do very little of it. But thankfully, we don't need to read at this level if we're reading for entertainment or just for a bit of information. The first 2 levels will suffice just fine for that kind of reading. Level 3 is reading for understanding that they discussed thoroughly in Chapter 1, and we will talk about it more later. The final level, level 4, is syntopical reading. And it seems that they've coined that term. I tried to find it somewhere else and had a hard time finding it before they isolated it in the early 70s. But at this level, you're reading multiple books on a topic to come up with a new understanding that wasn't contained in any of those individual other books alone. In other words, you're understanding what multiple people have said on a topic, and based on what they say, you come up with an original understanding of the idea. Any researcher should be proficient at this level. They touch on this level of reading at the end of the book, and I'm pretty excited to read about that part. Okay, so that's chapter 2, the 4 levels of reading. Now we'll move on to chapter 3, the first level of reading, elementary reading. They devote only 1 chapter to this level because they assume that if you can read this book, you're already proficient at this level. They were writing in the early 1970s, and that's over 50 years ago now. Some things have changed a lot, and others have only changed a little. They spend a lot of time talking about how the U.S. has always been a big supporter of universal literacy. That is, everyone should be able to read at least at the elementary level. And this was how it helped us become the world power that we did, because so many people could read. And reading this made me sigh. I mean, I'm not really sure that it's still universally valued in our country, but I digress. The goal of teaching every student to read has never been met, even back when there was so much emphasis placed on it. Then they spend time going over the historical methods used by education professionals to teach children to read. There have been many of these, but mainly they are based on 2 different methods, and variations and combinations of each one have been tried. I was working in an elementary school in the early 1990s, and the head of elementary education came into a faculty meeting one afternoon. I'll never forget this. He informed all of our teachers that starting in the next year, they would have to teach reading in a completely different manner than how they had been teaching it. They would be following the latest research, he said. And that sounds great, right? Well, the teachers were unimpressed. I remember one of them saying, "I know how to teach reading. I teach reading by using phonics. That's how children learn to read." And that may sound like she had an attitude, but you have to understand that these teachers had been forced to completely change the way they were teaching reading several times over the past decade, and it seemed that each time the results were worse than they were before. So I could sympathize with her. Adler and Van Doren say that the main ways that have been used have been variations and combinations on either, number 1, sounding out the words, or number 2, learning whole words. When I was in 1st grade in 1968, back then kindergarten was not offered in Virginia public schools, so I began to read in 1st grade at age 6. And at the time, the teachers were using sight reading. We learned the alphabet, of course, as the year went on, and we learned the letter sounds, but we never used phonics. I learned to read fairly quickly and easily that way. I remember in 1st grade, sometime near the beginning of the year, the teacher divided us into reading groups, and she brought our group up when it was our turn. She had us open our books to the first page of the reading book, and she had on a chart the same page, in a larger thing that we could all see together. And she said, "Look at the picture." And so we did, and there was a girl and a boy and a dog, and she said, "Now, what do you think is happening in this picture?" And we said, "Well, there's a girl and a boy, and they're watching a dog." And she said, "Well, what's the dog doing?" And we said, "Well, it's either jumping or running." And she said, "Okay, here's what the words say." And she showed us at the bottom, "See, spot, run." She said, "Now, who do you think Spot is?" And we said, "Well, the dog." And she said, "Okay." Well, after that, it was like something had been unlocked for me. I don't know why, but once I saw those words and had them pronounced out loud, I could get it. But other kids did struggle. I remember that. And I've sometimes wondered, if she had taught us to read starting with phonics, would I have been able to read easily? Maybe not, because different methods work better for different brains. But for years, starting in the 1960s, I suppose, more people than ever were graduating from high school and going to college. And a startling number of them did not have a firm grasp on elementary reading. And that was a problem, of course, because it's difficult to function in high school and college if you don't have that level of skill. At the time of How to Read a Book's writing, educators and researchers were still searching for the perfect method of teaching so that all students could learn to read. And it's been about 15, 20 years since I've been in an elementary school, but I'm not sure they've found that method yet. So next, Adler and Van Doren isolate the 4 main stages of the elementary level of reading. You have to go through each stage to reach the next. So let's go back to our chart and home in on the first level. In level 1, the first stage a child must go through is called reading readiness. They must be able to see and hear, and of course this is not a requirement at all. I mean, a person can learn to read with Braille, but we're talking about reading a physical book. They have to have that physical ability. And this stage will ideally go on from the time a child is born until they're 6 or 7 years old. And they also need to be able to put several sentences together and, speak plainly. They do not encourage people to teach children to read before they are ready. And this depends on the child. Some children really are not ready to learn to read until they're 7 years old. And they say that it can harm a child's ability to learn later on by forcing them to work on something that they simply cannot do. It's very frustrating for the child, and it makes a lot of them learn to dislike reading altogether. And this dislike can stick with them for life. And I think that's really tragic. Moving on to stage 2, they learn to read very simple materials. This is usually accomplished in first grade in the United States when a child is between 6 and 7 years old. Sight words, like in my See Spot Run example, are what they're talking about here. And by the end of grade 1 in the U.S., most students have been introduced to and should be able to roughly read 300 to 400 words. Stage 3 is a rapid increase in vocabulary and an increasing understanding through using context clues. And I remember learning about those in early elementary school, like 2nd and 3rd grade. And they practice reading different types of materials like word problems and math, and they may read science articles and social studies through textbooks. And some of you may remember, if you're older, we had the Weekly Reader that would come out, and it was like a small magazine for elementary school age children, and we would read those and discuss current events and all kinds of things. I remember reading the article about them building Disney World in Florida and being so excited, thinking, oh my goodness, maybe we can go to that one because California was too far away. And then of course they also read stories and poetry. The hope is during this stage that they learn to read for fun. I mean, isn't that what everybody would hope for everybody else? Then they enter stage 4, and that's when the children hone in on abilities that they picked up in stage 3. They read with increasing speed and understanding, and they start comparing different types of reading, and this is when they tend to develop preferences for the types of books that they like to read. The hope is that the kids will reach this stage by the time they're ready to enter high school, usually by 13 or 8th grade. And I'm going to call this stage fluency. That's not what they call it, but that's what I'm going to call it. The reasons some kids never reach this stage are many, and they talk briefly about it. Lack of enrichment in the home can be a problem. Trying to teach them too early is definitely a problem. To me, this was really interesting. The focus that schools place on the first 2 stages of reading cause them to sometimes slight the skills that children need to enter stage 3 and stage 4. But once a student has mastered all 4 of these stages, they're competent, functionally literate individuals who should be ready for high school level work. But Adler and Van Doren also stress that a person is not a mature reader yet. For that, you need to accomplish and enter the next several levels. So when you move on to high school and college, it's a problem if you haven't reached this level. Traditionally in the U.S., reading wasn't taught in high school or college. But since this book came out, things have changed. There were instructional levels for all levels of reading ability in the high school where I worked, and I believe this is now probably the norm. They point out that this is necessary behind the high school level. They contend that most colleges have courses to get students who are lagging behind up to speed, but they shouldn't be necessary because students should be ready to read before they enter college. They recommend that high schools and colleges develop programs based on their book, and I think this is a great idea. I think it would be a wonderful course for high school students to have to take at some point in their career whenever they're ready for it, and they wouldn't be ready for it until they got past this elementary level of reading. And if they don't take the course in high school, I think it would be great if they had to take it as a college freshman, preferably their first semester, because it would really help prepare them for college work. Let me know in the comments if you've ever seen a class based on this book. They finish this chapter by saying that we should never be satisfied with stopping at the elementary level, not as citizens, not as teachers, and not as society as a whole. To have a functional democracy, people need to understand how to read beyond the basic elementary level. These 2 chapters were more interesting than I expected them to be. How about you? Did you learn something new? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. In the next video in this series, we'll move on to level 2, inspectional reading. So that's it for today. Hit like and subscribe for more information on nonfiction books of all sorts. And hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single video. If you'd like a list of recent award winners and recommended books, head over to my website and pick up last year's list of 100 award-winning titles. The link to my website is in the description box below. For more worthwhile nonfiction reading, check out my book, Library Lens Curated Collection of Superlative Nonfiction, where you'll find award-winning and expert-recommended titles on every topic. And keep an eye out for the release of my upcoming book, Library Lens Biographies, Autobiographies, and Memoirs. I'm sure that everyone will find something there to please. So until next time, happy reading.